Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this event, Gender-Based Violence and the Rule of Law, Improving Protections for Women. My name is Anya Prusa, and I'm the Slater Family Fellow here at the Wilson Center, and I also lead the Center's project on gender-based violence and the rule of law. In recognition of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, an international campaign that runs from November 25th through December 10th each year, the Wilson Center is hosting a series of events to explore the many facets of this problem globally. This is our 6th discussion in the last 2 weeks, and one that really gets to the heart of the challenges that gender-based violence presents for policymakers and for the way we respond to women who experience violence. And the scale of this challenge is staggering. 1 in 3 women worldwide will experience some form of gender-based violence during her lifetime, according to the World Health Organization. Often this violence takes the form of intimate partner abuse or domestic violence, but there are many forms of gender-based violence and they often overlap. That could include economic discrimination, sexual harassment, rape, female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and femicide, the killing of a woman due to her gender, and the most extreme form of gender-based violence. By the time a woman has been killed, there have often been numerous points along the way where the state could have intervened, where the system failed to protect that woman. COVID-19 has only exacerbated this problem. So what can policymakers and advocates do? We know that laws matter. Laws are the framework through which justice and assistance can be provided, but laws alone, even good laws, are not enough. Implementation matters. Training and capacity building matters. Resources matter. It is my privilege today to welcome 4 experts, each focused on a specific region of the world, to examine some of these challenges and to discuss how we can improve protections for women and reduce the prevalence of gender-based violence. Mushira Khattab is the former Minister of Family and Population of Egypt and a highly regarded human rights activist who coordinated efforts to combat gender-based violence in Egypt. She was also Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vice Chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and the former Ambassador of Egypt to South Africa and the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Mari Davtyan is an attorney and the head of the Center for Protection of Victims of Domestic Violence, and she's an expert on legal issues for the Consortium of Women's Non-Governmental Organizations in the Russian Federation. She's also a member of the Working Group on the Draft Law on the Prevention of Domestic Violence for the Coordinating Council on Gender Issues at the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection, and a member of the Coordinating Council for the implementation of the National Strategy for Women. Mirel Ruiz is the coordinator of project to prevent and sanction femicides at the Fundación IDEA in Mexico. She previously served as a project manager for context analysis in the state of Mexico's Central Prosecutor's Office for the Attention of Crimes Linked to Gender Violence, and as financing coordinator at Amnesty International's Mexico office. Everjoy Mahuku is the Regional Gender and Emergencies Coordinator for CARE International, where she provides support to 15 country offices in East, Central, and Southern Africa on gender and gender-based violence integration for both emergency and development work. She has over 10 years of experience working on gender and development with both international and local partners. Welcome to all of you, and we are delighted that you are able to join us. Before we dive into the discussion, I also want to thank our partners within the Wilson Center for this event: the Brazil Institute, the Latin America Program, the Middle East Program, the Mexico Institute, the Kennan Institute, and the Maternal Health Initiative. I also want to remind our audience that you can submit questions for the panelists via Twitter. Just use the hashtag #GenderAtWilson or through email to mexico@wilsoncenter.org. So I'm going to ask an initial question of all our panelists to kick off the discussion. And Everjoy, we're going to start with you and then turn to our other speakers. And that question is, how effective are existing laws and policies against gender-based violence in your region? And where are there gaps and barriers, whether legal, societal, or implementation, or in other areas? So where are the gaps and barriers that are allowing gender-based violence to persist? Everjoy, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Anya. Good afternoon or evening to you all. It is a pleasure to be with you as we commemorate the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. I would want to thank the Wilson Center for inviting CARE to participate in this forum. And I would also want to thank all of you for taking time to be with us. In response to the question that you have posed, Anya, on the effectiveness of the laws and policies of gender-based violence with specific reference to Sub-Saharan Africa, I would want to acknowledge first that there has been some progress to combating gender-based violence across the region. Normally, there is a danger of dismissing the progress that has been made when one is confronted with the statistics that you have already given us on gender-based violence. A rise in figures can mean one or two things. One, greater visibility of GBV as a human rights violation, or an increase of those affected reporting GBV, which for me is something that is very good. Most of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa have passed legislation that outlaws or criminalizes some of the practice, such as domestic violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, sexual harassment, early child marriage, female genital mutilation. In Southern Africa, 13 of the 16 countries already have domestic violence legislation. 14 countries have legislation related to sexual exploitation, and 16 of the countries have signed on human trafficking. However, despite the comprehensive laws and policies against GBV remains endemic in most of the countries. There is high prevalence of intimate partner violence, as you have already heard, which is high in some of the Sub-Saharan countries, as high as 58% in DRC, 48% in Mozambique, and 47% in Zambia. We also have evidence of early forced marriages, which remains a common phenomenon across the countries, despite the fact that there are laws that criminalize early child marriage. However, this is not to say that these policies and laws are ineffective. What it only does is that it challenges us to ask ourselves what more needs to be done. In CARE, as an organization, we believe that combating gender-based violence requires a holistic approach across multiple levels that calls for the dismantling of patriarchy by supporting the empowerment of marginalized groups because of their gender identities, engaging allies for change, transforming social institutions and norms, and strengthening state institutions and legal and policy frameworks that address gender-based violence. GBV is a systemic problem rooted in gendered power dynamics, and it is something that we need to recognize. Laws and policies alone will not result in behavior change. Normative change or even effective enforcement at local level. Dominant gender norms often perpetuate systemic GBV in societies and act as a barrier to legal redress for women and adolescent girls. Looking at the region, GBV remains sensitive, hidden, and stigmatized across the region. Women and adolescent girls do not seek legal redress due to a variety of factors, including fear of reprisal, shame, and fear of stigmatization, economic dependence, lack of alternatives. Alternative means of resolving GBV issues and normalizations of violence itself. Limited capacity and entrenched patriarchal attitudes of law enforcement agents such as the police, judiciary, most of these institutions which are actually male dominated also has a bearing on the enforcement of laws. There is also lack of awareness of available legislation for the affected population, especially those who are in the rural areas. There is also an availability of quality services or referral systems. So whilst we are also talking about law enforcement, what we are saying is that there is more that needs to be done. At an institutional level, this is evidenced by the lack of funding for GBV-related policy implementation. Reports of poor coordination and accountability for GBV services and overall lack of response of services to support people affected by GBV. Safe spaces, shelters for survivors of gender-based violence, those things, they are not even available, or even economic opportunities or alternatives. Polarization of GBV is also endemic, resulting in lack of inquiry or investigation on allegations of GBV perpetrated by state parties. Conflict between formal laws, traditional and religious practices. In some of the countries, there is observance of both traditional and religious laws and formal laws, which leads to different interpretation of the laws. Care works not only at systems level on policies for addressing GBV, but also at community levels to shift social norms on acceptability of violence, as well as individual and interpersonal levels. At individual level, care works with those affected to assert their voice and realize their lives, their right to a life free of gender-based violence. Remember, I talked about people accepting that gender-based violence is normal. And thereby strengthening their individual and collective agency. Care also works at relational level to enable people of all genders and age to negotiate and create healthy relationships within families and communities built upon mutual respect, open communication, solidarity, and non-violence. Then we also work at structural level, where we work with groups to negotiate rights, choices, access to resources and services, formal and informal institutions, transforming social norms and practices to respond to GBV. Hence, we call for a need for holistic and multi-level interventions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Everjoy. I suspect many of the themes that you touched on, resources, implementation, the cultural roots of gender-based violence, we're going to hear from our other panelists as well. I want to turn next to Mirel Ruiz to discuss, Latin America and Mexico more specifically.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you to the Wilson Center for having me. And I'm really glad to share this table with such an amazing women. So thank you very much. Well, to answer the question, I will give a quick overview on the status of laws and public policies in the region in Latin America. And then I will jump in the No More Femicides project, Ni un Feminicidio Más, which is a project financed by USAID. And we as a team are currently implementing in northern Mexico. So in the region, I think it's kind of similar what is happening in Africa, for example. There has been a trend to legislate with regard GBV, gender-based violence, or GBV, as a specific public issue that needs to be addressed in a specialized, multidisciplinary and systemic approach. So almost every country in Latin America has already national laws and programs specialized to tackle GBV. There you can find already detailed description of types of violence and also the spaces where these violence can be perpetrated. So it has been a lot of work done in the definition of these crimes. A lot of work done in the classification of femicide as a crime that has gender components, and that these components has to be taken into consideration to investigate and sanction these crimes. These policies also have considered specialized mechanisms to protect women. An example is here in Mexico, we have the gender alert, which is a mechanism that can be activated in specific territories where the incidence of femicides is at a high level. So by request of civil society organizations, this mechanism compelled the authorities to carry out urgent measures to face the problem. So there are some examples there of these efforts that we as a region are doing. So in theory, it seems like everything has been classified and categorized. However, in practice, there's more to develop in the field work. Currently, we are 3 organizations, X, Fundación IDEA, and Fortis. We are working together in this project, Ni un feminicidio más, which is a project that aims to strengthen institutional capacities of the authorities to prevent, investigate, and sanction femicides. So they are the people who are in charge of implementing these laws and all these normative framework. So we work with the state judicial power, with the state attorney's office. We work with local police and also with the direction for the orientation support and for victims and witnesses. And in all that work, we have designed and pilot solutions from a human-centered approach. So that means that everything that we are doing it came by listening to public officials. So what they need, what are their main concerns, their priorities, their necessities. So during the first phase of the project, we were dedicated to listening to public officials. And then with all that information, we designed some solutions. And in that work also, we identify 3 items that we consider fundamental to have a better implementation of programs to address GBV. So the first one is practical training. Second one is the existence of tools and guidelines. And the third one is the relevance of interagency communication and coordination between the authorities that are involved in the prevention and response to femicides. The first one, practical training. I want to highlight practical because kind of obvious to do a training, to do practical training, but public officials needs to know what do we expect from their intervention, from their role, how gender perspective looks like in the field work. So how to approach victims without gender stereotypes. And with that, they need spaces to practice, to work, to solve problems with hypothetical cases or real cases, but they need to have these workshops or spaces to practice and to take decisions in a controlled environment. The second one is complementary, but it's the necessity of these tools and guidelines to standardize some processes, some legal proceedings. So in that way, every victim receives the same provision of care. And that also minimizes the possibility to have erratic decisions, decisions that are based on subjective criteria, based on sometimes gender stereotypes. So we think that's very important to have these tools to standardize processes. And the third one is the relevance to promote the interagency communication and coordination, because victims needs this comprehensive support every step of the way. And in that, for that matter, you need all the actors have the same vision, the same standards. So these three key items where we have been working with these authorities to focus on that, to produce tools that are realistically viable in the field. Well, so finally, maybe you're questioning yourselves if all these efforts, all these policies are being effective. And to be honest, in the region, most of the times we don't have enough information. We don't have enough data to draw into conclusions about if these policies are having an impact in the current lives of women and girls. I think we are on the way. There's a long way to go there, but we are on the way to build IT systems, specialized systems to actually have more information and a better understanding of the problem we are facing. But well, what I can say with certainty is that to these interventions more sustainable and more successful, there's a need to invest in capacity building, because these people, these public officials are in charge actually to implement these national policies at the subnational level. So that's, we think we are having a really interesting experience in this project, and I would be very glad to share with you more in the section of questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mirel. I suspect we're going to come back to a number of those points when we get to our discussion. I'm going to turn next to Mari Davtian. If you could tell us about your work and the current context in Russia right now.
Thank you so much. Good evening and good afternoon to all participants. I'm really glad to join to this discussion. Russia is quite complicated country when we talk about gender-based violence and domestic violence. I think, you know, Russia does not adopt a law against domestic violence. We are the last one country that doesn't have any legislation against domestic violence. I'm an attorney and I'm the head of the Center for legal aid to victims of domestic violence. We provide free legal aid to victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse all over Russia. We try to find lawyers and attorneys in the region where victim lives and to support, to go to court, to police office, and try to help to have a legal access to justice. When we talk about Russia, I can say that the problem of domestic violence was discussed in Russia since the end of 80s. And Russia had like numerous bills and draft laws against domestic violence, but still we do not have domestic violence law. And our government decided that it is not enough, and in 2017 we decriminalized battery against family members. So today, battery against a family member, or how it's called in Russian law, loved ones, is not a crime. It's an administrative offense. This is one of the biggest problems that we faced all these years, because for battery against a family member, you can get a fine like about $100. Moreover, the crimes that we usually see in situation of domestic violence, for example, intentional infliction of light body injuries, is a crimes of private prosecution in Russia. I know that many countries in, I think maybe 20, 30 years ago had the same procedure of private prosecution, but it's not a modern procedure in many, many countries today. What does it mean? It means that if you are victim of light body injuries, you have to file a statement and you have an obligation to investigate the case against investigate the case that you initiated in a magistrate court. Police and prosecutors are not involved in whole this procedure of investigation, and victim has to collect evidence by herself and to represent whole the case to the judge. So our experience says that in 90% of cases, it is impossible to do for victim without lawyer or attorney. And moreover, it's not safe for victims because Russia doesn't have protection orders or restraining orders. So we do not have any effective mechanism to protect victims in the periods of investigation, prosecution in court, or after we have like statement in the police. This procedure of private prosecution in situation of domestic violence have been criticized, I think, numerous times by right defenders and the UN Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Russia is a member of conventions of the CITES Convention, but still, this is the cases we have. And I can say that as Russia does not have any system, we do not have this comprehensive approach to a problem of domestic violence, and we do not have any system. So we do not have relevant statistics because we just don't have a definition of domestic violence. We do not have any protection mechanisms, and we do not, Russian government does not oblige to provide crisis centers to women. We have crisis centers. We have NGOs, and even we have governmental crisis centers, but it's not an obligation of the state by Russian laws. So of course, we usually have a problem to access to crisis centers. And in this situation, the next, when we meet the problem of laws, and of course we meet the problem of stereotypes and myths, myths in police, myths in investigation offices, courts, any stakeholders and authorities, because domestic violence is not an issue for Russia on the official level. So we do not have special trainings for prosecutors, police officers, and other stakeholders. I know that not so many countries face the same problems, and majority countries all over the world still have much more better legislation against domestic violence than Russia. But still, several years ago, we faced the problem, I think, that many countries faces today. There's a problem of self-defense in the cases of domestic violence. I talked with many of my colleagues from other countries, for example, from Ukraine, Georgia, United Kingdom. Our researchers show that majority of women who was sentenced after killing their partner try to defend themselves in situation of domestic violence. And it's very common situation for many countries. And we met that legislation, like majority countries are very on self-defense, very conservative and are not very, so we can't implement it in effective way in situation of domestic violence, because we understand that usually women do not have so much power to protect themselves without knife or other weapon, for example. In many countries, if you have weapon and kill someone who doesn't have weapon, it is a crime, even if you are talking about self-defense. And all these challenges, I think we have to start to discuss on the international level. Because even if Russia had some very big problems with legislation, the other countries have the same problems in the legislation of self-defense. And we will meet it, we meet it today, and we will meet it tomorrow, more and more, because defense of women in situation of domestic violence are usually women usually use something like knives or guns and stuff like this. And usually police officers, judges, and prosecutors have the same myths that she was provoked, that she was, like, for example, if she was drunk, she could not write to use some defense and stuff like this. All these myths that we listen in situations of domestic violence, we listen in the cases of self-defense in situation of domestic violence. But we do not have this international standards. If we talk about domestic violence, usually we have CEDAW, Istanbul Convention, that talk about what positive obligations of the state is. But the issue of self-defense in domestic violence situation is a quite new issue. And we do not have, I think, international standards and a good approach to all these challenges that we meet in these cases. And I think we should to discuss it too. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mari. I think the situation in Russia is a reminder of how important it is for women to have legal protections. You know, not just questions of implementation, right, but actually passing laws that guarantee certain rights to women who are facing violence. I'm next going to turn it over to Moshira Khatab, who has substantial experience, not just developing policies, but also implementing them in Egypt, and is an expert in the Middle East more broadly. Moshira, over to you.
Thank you, Anya, and it's really a great pleasure to be with you. My thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'm very honored to be with this group of very inspiring women so far. What Eva Joy mentioned sounds very familiar. Surprisingly, what Marie said about Russia is also not strange to us. And what Mireille spoke about sounds the same. So I thought that our part of the world is the one not doing its homework, but it seems that we are all in the same boat. Let me say that as we celebrate International Human Rights Day tomorrow, December 10, we must remember that laws and policies are indispensable for the implementation of human rights. As indispensable as they may be, laws and policies are not enough, as Eva Joy and Marie mentioned now. Almost all MENA countries have passed and issued strategies to prevent gender-based violence and to empower women. Significant progress is achieved, no doubt. However, as we have heard, and similarly here in the MENA region, while laws and policies are a step in the right direction, their impact has yet to be felt on the ground. There are lingering gaps and missing links. Laws are a reflection of the prevailing culture, a culture which needs to shift dramatically. Like we've heard, child marriage and FGM, though criminalized by law, are flagrant forms of gender-based violence that remain mysteriously intertwined with culture. I worked for years and years to change the culture concerning female genital mutilation, child marriage, gender-based violence, and I managed to put in place good laws. Till now, though illegal, such heinous crimes are still promoted as forms of chastity, purity, social protection in very dark, remote areas. they are still acquiesced to by elements of society, ranging from law enforcement to uneducated parents, brainwashed educators, and more. A solid education system which teaches women and girls to understand and fight for their rights is paramount in the face of these pressures. And what Marie said about Russia sounds very familiar in cases of domestic violence. The law enforcement would tell the woman, don't leave your home, you will ruin your family, go back and live with your husband. So we must change this culture. And this is really where we need to make the shift. Existing laws afford women more rights than those they actually enjoy. So there is a problem with the application of the law due to cultural reasons. As such, greater efforts are needed to make our timid laws a reality by giving women their full set of constitutional rights. Most constitutions provide for equality and non-discrimination, yet on reality, the situation is different. So raising awareness and building a culture of women's rights needs to be positioned as value accretive to men as well. It's in the best interest of men, not only women. So MENA is currently at a critical stage in containing the pandemic, like the rest of the world. COVID-19 outbreak risks further exacerbating existing fragilities and inequalities. While not publicized in the MENA region, the pandemic has led to resurgence of violence against women all over the world. Economic deprivation, psychosocial stress, and stay-at-home measures are leading to substantial increase in intimate partner and domestic violence. Fragile gains in some countries could be diminished if concerted efforts are not made to ensure economic assistance and flexible modalities for income generation in conjunction with support for caregiving roles. Widespread conflicts in our part of the world, displacement, and migration in the region significantly complicates a managed response to COVID-19. And extreme water scarcity makes preventive measures even more challenging. Policies need to come as an integral component of a set of measures, as Everjoy mentioned, and I think Mireille Lewis also alluded to. There must be a coherent, integral set of measures taken to combat gender-based violence. Such measures start by ratifying relevant international conventions and honoring the commitments that comes with this ratification, such as harmonizing national laws with international standards to avoid the situation that Mary talked about in Russia, which, like I said, sounds very familiar in our part of the world. And I'm really surprised to know that we have similar problems like Russia. I thought that Russia is much better than us, but we have a serious problem with reporting domestic violence, serious problem with punishing the perpetrators in domestic violence. So putting these measures is very crucial. Plus harmonizing the national laws, we must put in place a centralized data system by consistently collecting and analyzing sex, age, and disability, etc., etc. This aggregated data in all preparedness and response interventions. Governments are encouraged to work in, and I underline, transparent and effective, underline again, partnership with different stakeholders, starting by the national civil society organizations. Governments must empower CSOs, must allocate adequate resources to the maximum available extent and through international cooperation where needed. Capacity building, as I think Mireille spoke about, capacity building of all professionals dealing directly or indirectly with GBV. Must put in place an independent monitoring and evaluation system to guide and correct implementation, because usually we don't know the way. So we have to monitor the implementation and correct where needed. Without effective and genuine participation of women in each step, GBV will persist, if not rise. We must not lose sight of the fact that a culture of women's rights still curb domestic violence, will curb domestic violence, child marriage, and violence in the workplace. And I thank you very much and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Before I start the discussion, I just want to remind our audience, you can submit questions on Twitter. I use the hashtag #GenderAtWilson or by email to mexico@wilsoncenter.org. So to start the discussion, all of you really touched on the need to change culture, right? Change the way our societies view gender and gender-based violence. And I'm curious to know if that is possible without also changing representation within governments, right? So we look around the world, governments still are often male-dominated. Is it necessary to have more women in office to actually change culture on the ground in a way that makes, that reduces gender-based violence? Moshira, I see you nodding, so I'm going to turn to you first.
Yes, definitely. Women must have a seat at the table. We cannot make the change without the participation of women. And on each step, as I mentioned, women must participate. They must express their views and they must be heard. In Egypt now, we have the highest number of female ministers, 25%. In the parliament, we have 25%. And we hope one day we will get to our true representation, 50%.
Thank you. Everjoy, I know you mentioned, the cultural roots, right? And how gender-based violence is a reflection of traditional power dynamics. So could you speak a little bit more to that and prospects for change in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Okay, thank you very much, Anya. Just to start, I want to say something. Normally, when you start saying by changing culture, you are likely to face opposition. What we want to do is not to change culture, but to transform the negative practices that are inherent within the cultures. So this is something that can actually happen and that we have actually seen happening within the areas that we work with. Because when we are talking about transformation, we are saying working with and through communities, you want them to identify what are some of the negative practices that are there. Let's talk about child marriages. What are the negative impacts or effects of child marriages? And when you have conversation with communities, you will find that they also want things that are better for their children. And this actually results in terms of transforming social norms and practices. So this is one of the things that we have found that is very critical, because we've noticed that the resistance, even remember I talked about entrenched patriarchal norms that we have with men who are actually in higher positions and who, in spite of the fact that there is progressive legislation, will continue to, to block the enforcement of the progressive laws. Once they also accept and they feel that this is not, they are not being pressurized to let go of their culture, but for them to understand that culture is dynamic, and because it's dynamic, changes happen, and they happen for the good of the family and for the good of the society. And I would also want to agree with what Mushiri said in terms of, yes, we need women to be part and parcel of the decision-making structures. It does not necessarily mean that when we have women, these women, they are also progressive, but we will need women whom we will educate for them to be able to understand. Because remember, we are talking about these entrenched cultural attitudes. Women also have entrenched cultural attitudes. That's why we're talking about women accepting that gender-based violence is normal. And the studies and researches that has been done by Wiki in Southern Africa also showed women, a higher number of women that is saying that it was normal for men to perpetrate gender-based violence on women. But because of the education that has been taking place, we notice that this attitude is actually shifting. So yes, we need women to participate in decision-making, and we also need to transform cultures. Thank you very much.
Moshira, we had a follow-up question from the audience right after your remarks as well. And Everjoy talked about this need, right, to transform the way communities are viewing some of these issues. Have you seen any transformation in Egypt, you know, through your own work at the community level?
Yes. They call me the FGM lady or woman. I worked on the ground for 6 or 7 years to educate the communities that practice FGM as a religion. Regardless of their religion, Muslim, Christian, Jews, or non-believers, they all practice FGM. So I had to reach out to them and ask them, why do you do this? And I found out that they do this out of fear. They are afraid that the girls will not marry if she's not circumcised, because circumcision, they call it purification. And this is how I want to explain to Everjoy that sometimes you really need to change the culture. When the culture condones, and culture here is customs. It's the meaning of culture has changed now. It's the everyday customs and traditions and habits of the masses. It's no longer the elites acquiring paintings and listening to classic music. Culture is about the masses and mostly the grassroots. So we have to alleviate their fears. I had to bring religious leaders from every religion. I had to bring doctors to explain to them that there is no medical need for FGM, that no religion whatsoever calls for torture, and this is torture. And we had to support them to face the social pressure, because really they are vulnerable and they are weaker than the pressure. So we cannot let them stand alone facing this. And we supported them in many ways. We made the village declaration against FGM, where we invited every single person in the village to go on stage, sign a petition. For them, it was elating. For them, it was a sign of strength that their signature is needed to stop such a crime. And with such a collective act, usually we had 10,000 people in a tent to say no to FGM. And we declared more than 100 villages. And this is how we got the support of the grassroots to criminalize FGM. And I was able to criminalize FGM after 5 years working closely in very remote areas with the vulnerable groups who used to circumcise their girls. And men stood up on the stage to say how much they suffered from marrying a circumcised girl. And mothers said, we made a mistake. And we apologize to our daughters that we did this. So this public declaration made them feel stronger. And this is how, Everjoy, this is how we were able to change a culture that tortured a girl in the name of purity, chastity, and to make it a crime punishable by law. We had a revolution in 2011, and when the Islamists took over, the first bill that was presented to the parliament was to delete the criminalization of FGM and child marriage. And guess who defended it? The civil society. Because the civil society had a sense of ownership because they worked on it. We worked through everybody. Civil society, religious leaders, doctors, nurses, you name it. And victims of FGM and child marriage. And this is how you make a sustainable change. And those vulnerable groups feel that they are the champions of the change, that it's to their credit. This is how we changed it.
Mari, I wanted to ask you, to respond to this question about, the cultural roots of gender-based violence. You mentioned domestic violence, and obviously there are real challenges to kind of bringing that out of the bedroom, so to speak, right? We often see domestic violence, intimate partner violence as being something that happens behind closed doors, something that is part of the relationship, maybe not something for the state to address. And so within, Russia and your experience, how do gender norms and cultures, how are they shaping those policy discussions?
I have been working for like 12 years in this area. And I can say that, for example, 10 years ago, nobody wanted to talk about domestic violence issue. Only women's NGOs tried to raise discussions about it because this is a family matter, and all these traditional approaches to family and to domestic violence was very popular even in society. Today, I can say that social researchers show in Russia that majority of people know about domestic violence as a problem in Russia. And majority of people say that this problem has to be decided by legislation. It was like 10 years we worked, our colleagues. First of all, it is always women's NGO. So this is an answer why women have to be represented in all areas, because only women are interested in women's problems. And all these 10 years, women worked with society, with government, with police, with prosecutors, with judges. We talked with media. And today I can say, for example, mass media we have very good articles against domestic violence. We have very good discussion in media against domestic violence. But on the government level, we still live like 10 years ago. And maybe it is a surprise, but we have so many women in our government, only 70% in State Duma. I believe this is an answer. I believe that when we will have more women in government, when we will have more women in State Duma and Council of Federation, we will have the laws and we will have policies to combat all the stereotypes and all this traditional culture in police officers and law enforcement areas.
And Mirel, I wanted to get your perspective on this as well, because I know in Mexico, the government has actually discounted the scale of the problem with gender-based violence and femicide.
Yeah, well, I want to add an insight about representation. In terms of, I think representation maybe is the first step to start to change culture, or one of the steps but also I think, well, last year in Mexico, I was remembering, there has been published a law to guarantee the gender equality, gender parity in all of the spaces of decision making. So that's a great, I think we are getting into the right direction, but there are some other aspects that are really important to actually women can be part of this decision-making process, no? where the decisions are taken. So, for example, women, we need options to reconcile family work with the daily work, and other options, because we are we continue to it's not about job presentation, but also the possibilities to actually exercise this job. I'm not sure if I'm losing the connectivity.
You went out briefly, but we can hear you clearly now.
Yeah, okay. So, well, I want to share with you some other aspects about how to work with these biases and gender stereotypes with police about where police officers have been open to reflect of their own bias, because there are public officials or police officers that actually live situations of them to work with them because they are the first phase. And in the change of culture, we think we can do a job there to help them to make some reflection of these biases and how to start to change it, but by practice. So, well, it has been a very interesting possibility. And yeah, to open these kind of spaces for people also.
Thank you. And I know Everjoy also mentioned, the police and the judiciary and the importance of bringing those groups on board. Have you done work with CARE International in sort of capacity building or trainings in those areas? And what would you recommend? How do we make sure that the people who are tasked with implementing laws are actually, implementing them in a way that helps women?
Okay, thank you very much. Like you have indicated, one, there's need to build the capacity of police and judiciary to understand gender as well as the gender dynamics. CARE as an organization, normally we work with various stakeholders, and some of those stakeholders actually include police, government departments. And one of the things that we do is we train them in gender for them to be able to understand what gender is all about. Initially, I know when we started, people had different perceptions of what gender actually meant. For them, it was only about women. But when they understand it's about understanding the relations between men and women and how they can actually be improved, then they actually start to understand. And for me, especially when we're talking about issues of having them on board, it is very critical to have them on board. And the only way that they can be on board is if they understand exactly what the impact of gender-based violence, even at personal level. Because when we're talking about gender, we are not talking about something that happens somewhere, but we are actually referring to things that they actually live with on a day-to-day basis. So yes, we provide gender awareness training. Then we also look at gender-based violence. What is the impact of gender-based violence? But in some of the countries, you will also find that the government, through the Ministry of Women's Affairs, has also taken that leadership to train or capacitate the police and judiciary. But the challenge that we have is the issue of resources. You find that normally you work with those police or judiciary who are working specifically with issues of gender-based violence. And then that means most of the staff are actually not trained on gender. And that creates challenges. So it should be something that should be integrated right within, might be the curriculum of the police or the judiciary, so that when they actually come out, they understand and they already have gender lenses.
This
Thank
is
you.
very important, Anya. What Eva Joy is saying, building the capacity of every professional working directly or indirectly with GBV, even judges, police officers, government officials, members of the civil society, and most importantly, we must educate the society and men at the forefront that they gain to benefit when there is no gender-based violence, when women get their rights unimpaired. Very important to have them on board, like Eva Joy says.
Thank you. And now, Mari, the government in Russia is not leading this conversation. You mentioned that civil society is stepping up in many areas to try to help bridge this gap. You know, is civil society able to work with the police, able to work with prosecutors?
We have these programs in several regions. It always depends on the region and the chief of police office in this region and the activities of women's NGO in this region. We worked with Federal Institute for Police Officers. We worked with them for many years, and once or twice in a year we had training programs for police officers all over Russia. But today, in the period of pandemic, we do not have these classes. But I know that regions try to work. And sometimes it really depends on how active women's NGO in regions. We have very good regions where they very active and work with police, prosecutors, judges. But I can say that's like it's 4 or 5 regions of Russia. We have 83 regions.
Wow. And Mirel, I mean, you have really focused with Fundación Idea on training police. How receptive are police in Mexico? Does it vary in your experience to kind of learning about gender and incorporating a gender lens in their work? Oh, I think we may have.
I think she's.
I think we may have lost Mirel.
No, she needs to be unmuted.
Yes. Mirel, the question was, you've done a lot of work with Fundación Idea with police forces in Mexico. How receptive have they been to that training?
Well, thank you for the question, Anya. You tell me if I'm lost a little, or if you're losing me. It has been such a challenging experience, but I think the approach that we made with them was I don't know, I don't want to say the right way, but it has been very successful in terms of we create these open communication channels with them. It's a project of 4 years, so we have built a relation with them with trust and transparency. So in that way, they don't feel judged. His biases. So they have been very resistant to accept that femicides are not doing well or as expected, and that we can do. Maybe I will turn off the camera.
Maybe yes. If you turn off the camera, yeah.
I'm really, really sorry. I don't know what is going on. But, I was saying that they have been very open, very receptive to learn, because actually they want to understand how to approach victims. It's not that simple for them to just act without biases, because they don't necessarily understand what is that. So for example, we have worked with them with this concept of the ideal victim. And we have, like, by some exercise, think about what how does a victim, an ideal victim looks like? So in that question, we can see these stereotypes. So they tend to think that every victim looks the same, and every victim maybe has the same behavior. So with them, we work with this exercise to help them to realize that every case, every victim is different. Every history is it's completely different, and how to see victims with this intersectional perspective also to understand different kind of oppressions. So to identify what happened is if this victim, a migrant victim, or a migrant victim that has disabilities. So we have worked with them in all this in this human-centered approach, and I think that has been very successful because they want to learn, and we are also receptive to hear and to learn, to listen to their concerns, and in that way we design solutions. So we have designed specific tools to help them to put in practice gender perspective in the field. I want to mention some examples. We have police action, domestic protocol. We have also, as Mauricia mentioned, a guide to judge with gender perspective, for example. So that's one of the experiences that we are having. Thank you.
And then, you know, of course, in parallel, right, to capacity building among police and judges and prosecutors, you also need women to feel comfortable coming forward. So one of the questions we got from our audience is, how do you do that, right? How do you make sure that women know what resources are available and encourage them to step forward and report, you know, especially in a situation, you know, like Mari said, right, where if you do come forward, you might actually be responsible for prosecuting your own case, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, Mari, if you want to start with that, is how do we, you know, encourage women and support them when they come forward?
First of all, we try to unite with different NGOs. For example, we provide legal aid. Our colleagues provide shelter. Sometimes we try to use support of media. And, you know, women who come to us usually don't have any other way. In Russia, majority women call to police when they really don't have any other way, because every woman in Russia, especially after decriminalization of domestic violence, know that police doesn't work with these cases. So when someone tries to go forward, we try to do, first of all that we can to provide protection, like physical protection, first of all. And mostly this is NGOs who do it, unfortunately.
Can I say something?
Please go ahead.
We have to know that the primary responsibility lies on the state, on the government. And civil society organizations can help, but states must live up to their commitments. So I established 2 helplines, one for children and one for women. And I was faced with a lot of resistance. They were scared. They said, you're gonna expose our weaknesses. You're gonna show that the public service is too weak, does not respond to the need. But you have to alleviate again, tell them, no, it's only children complaining, and you take it step by step. Most importantly is to make this helpline available nationwide. That's why the government has to put assistance and put resources, capacity building of those receiving the calls, and networking with the police, with the shelters, with everyone. But it is primarily the responsibility of the state to ensure easy access to a mechanism of complaint and then easy access to the law. A woman can easily go to the court to seek justice. This is very, very important. And, you know, at least in the MENA region, everybody is afraid of change. So you have to explain to them, Eva Joy, you have to tell them that you stand to win from the change we want to make. I mean, if you beat a woman, her children will be scarred forever and the husband will suffer. You have to explain to everyone that it is in their best interest to make sure that women gain their rights unimpaired. It's in the best interest of men, of the family, of the society at large. And you will find more resistance inside the government because bureaucrats are classic by nature. And calling for women's rights is a new movement because we grew up to think that they protect women because women are vulnerable, so women should not work in this field or in that domain, should not go to school because she may be sexually harassed on her way, so on and so forth. So we need to educate everybody. Media must work, religious institution must work, everybody must work to educate the society.
Thank you. We have about 15-20 minutes left. So I actually want to ask a question about COVID-19 because it has obviously worsened many of the risk factors for gender-based violence. In some ways, it's made it harder for women to seek support services, shelters have closed, etc. But at the same time, there has been growing awareness of the issue of gender-based violence. We've seen headlines around the world. So how has, COVID-19 impacted gender-based violence in each of your regions and women's abilities to access services and access justice? See who would like to go first. Moshira, would you like to?
Yes, actually COVID-19 made it worse because the lockdown meant that women stayed at home with their oppressors, vulnerable groups living in smaller houses, poor facilities, children don't go to school and the husband doesn't go to work. And most probably some people lost their job with the lockdown because we know that unemployment rose very much and women tend to work, more women tend to work in the informal sector with no guarantees, no securities. They were laid off and children not going to school. So women had to look after children, look after her husband, and she was absent from her own work. Poorer children not going to school lost the protection of the school, and they were abused at home because the lower the socioeconomic situation of a family, the higher the level of domestic violence, be it against women, children, or the man maybe. So really COVID-19 made it worse, especially that most systems cracked, health system cracked, social protection system, globally, no country was exempted from this because COVID-19 took the world by surprise and nobody knew how to deal with it. So we were trying to find our way. I organized the first webinar on the repercussions of COVID-19 globally, the first webinar, and truly nobody knew. I mean, the protocol for treatment was unknown, transmission of infection was unknown, how to deal with pre-existing condition patients, nobody knew. Many people were laid off and restaurants closed. It was the economic havoc of COVID-19 was the worst humanitarian crisis. more than the health situation. And while men suffered, but women suffered the most with the psychosocial economic repercussions, really. Women faced a lot. And as I said in my intervention, up till now, we have not went back to where we were before COVID-19, and the situation in some countries is very bad with the second wave, and now we hear about the third wave. Still, we don't know what will happen. Still, we don't know whether we will ever go back to the normal of pre-COVID-19. Definitely, there will be a new normal. How will we adjust? I don't know. It's a very fragile situation, especially for women. And I hope that the world will come together. Stronger international cooperation is needed to help poorer countries and to help poorer communities, because also COVID-19 showed its ugly face of discrimination. The poorer, the most vulnerable, suffered more from COVID-19.
And Everjoy, have you seen similar trends with COVID-19 in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I actually agree with what Mushiri has said. The COVID-19 exposed the systemic inequalities that already existed in Sub-Saharan Africa. It led to an increase in intimate partner violence that she has already said, as women were locked together with their abusers, or even men, because we also have reports of men being abused. But one thing that I would want to highlight is that what CARE did immediately once we had this COVID, we conducted some rapid gender analysis. And one of the first things that we pointed out was the risk of gender-based violence, especially in light of the containment measures or lockdown measures that were introduced. And we noticed that there were serious implications. We had an increase in domestic violence. We had an increase of people using hotline, reporting that there was gender-based violence. And remember, these people could not actually find any protection during that particular time. Then we also had instances of services not being available, which means the protection services that was there was also not there. Then in terms of shelters, there were also like demands for people to be tested first before they could be admitted to shelters, which created the situation, which made the situation hostile. However, one of the things that I would also want to note is that it made the GBV visible to such an extent that even governments started to prioritize GBV as an essential services, which before they had not done. Because initially when COVID started, GBV was not regarded as an essential services. But after the outcry, after the statistics started coming in, they had to move it to become one of the essential services. And I think we all know what happened in South Africa. We had the president committing some funds, which for me actually was something that was positive, because there was need for governments to take action. Thank you.
And Mari in Russia, has, COVID-19 also exacerbated the situation there? I'm guessing yes, unfortunately.
Yes, sure. We have the same problems as in other countries. But we have a very good example how sometimes NGOs can work together. In the spring, we publicly asked Ministry of Internal Affairs not to punish women who violate restrictions rules in lockdown period when they try to save themselves against after domestic violence. And for example, today, usually police officers don't punish women who, for example, violate lockdown rules when try to go to shelter or medical assistance. So this is a good case that we had in COVID period, but we have the same problems, problem to access to medicine, problems with unemployment and houses.
And Mirel, I saw you nodding while Mari was speaking.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of the same. There has been a devastating increase in domestic violence during the pandemics. Also, an increase in the incidence of tentatives of femicide. And also the femicides that have been committed during this period had a really manifest an extreme violence against women. So the way that women are being killed is critical. I think it's brutal. And of course, institutions are exceeded completely in their capacities. So police officers, judges, or public prosecutors have been infected. So we are working with a low capacity of the authorities to respond to this emergency. And there's also another problem here in Mexico, because there's the government not necessarily recognize that there's a problem there. So there are some declarations like everything is going well in households, and I think they are not taking seriously the problem, because it's for real that there has been an increase in these incidents. And I think in this period, in this situation, the role of the civil society organizations has become fundamental to get the information to victims, to get information of specialized services, because it's completely understandable why a victim doesn't, a woman doesn't want to proceed with a complaint. It's completely understandable. Sometimes it's not an option when they live with the perpetrator, but maybe they can access to other measures of protection or other services that civil society organizations provide. So that's I think that has been the trend here in Mexico to help women to have relevant information, to have other options. But I think it's very delicate, the position where they are during this pandemic. There are no options. Also, with these police officers, we have worked in specific tools to give women information that can be used at sometimes, but just to help them to know that there are options. But well, I share with you the concern and the urgency to take it seriously, that something wrong during this period.
Thank you. We have a
thing, Anya.
Yeah, really.
Because the lockdown has cost the world a lot, I see more care now to avoid the lockdown. As we go through the second wave, not everybody is rushing to the lockdown. And look at President-elect Joe Biden, when he invites everybody, encourages everybody to wear the mask. I mean, this is, take precautions, and life has to go on, because people need to make a living, they need to go to work, children need to go to school. So I think we've learned the lesson. Lockdown cost us a lot. Of course, it was called for, because we were trying, as a humanity, we were trying to get to know the virus. We were taken by surprise. But now there is more caution in imposing lockdown, total lockdown. I think it's just an observation.
Thank you. That actually segues really well. We have a few minutes left, and so I wanted to just ask each one of you in 1 minute or less, if possible, what recommendation do you have going forward? So an easy question, I think. Everjoy, perhaps we could start with you.
Okay, thank you very much. For me, what I've noticed is that change is happening and will continue to happen. The recommendation that I have is that there is need to harmonize the laws that exist, especially in countries where there are dual laws, traditional, religious, customary, and formal laws. There is need to harmonize the laws so that you speak one and the same language. Thank you.
Thank you. Mari, what do you think we should be doing?
Work with the stakeholders, at least into women's NGOs, I think.
Thank you. Mirel?
Yeah, as well as Mary said, listen to women, I think is the first step. Not assume that every women are the same. I think that's very important. Also, I would say that work with local actors, which are the people in charge to implement these national laws and national policies that are really well formulated. And maybe the last one is to work in the monitoring and evaluating of these programs, because we have a lot done there in this normative framework, but actually we need to know with the data what is going on, if this is having an impact in current lives of women and girls. So I could say that, but first to listen to women. Thank you.
Thank you. And Moshira, the final word to you.
I think I will not add anything to what has been said. If I may summarize, there was a consensus amongst all of us speakers that we must take an integrated set of measures. Like Everjoy said, harmonize laws. You must have policies and strategies. You must have a coordinating entity to coordinate the work of the different stakeholders. You must have a disaggregated data base to look at the disparities and target those that need it most. Government must work with the civil society and other partners like UN, international non-governmental organizations. We must work in partnership, international coordination, international cooperation, allocation of resources, capacity building of all professionals, raising the awareness of the society of the benefits that they gain from combating gender-based violence, monitoring and evaluation, like has just been said. These are all set of measures that must be implemented together to move forward. You have to act in a multidisciplinary approach and human rights based. We must not forget that we are talking about inalienable human rights of women. And as we celebrate the International Day of Human Rights, we must know that to implement human rights, you have to take these sets of measures that all of us talked about. And we're very grateful to the Wilson Center and to you, Anya. And I'm very honored to have taken part with these great ladies.
Thank you, Moshira. I don't think I could have put it better. You know, tackling the issue of gender-based violence, it is addressing women's right to live free of fear from violence, right? And that is incredibly important. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Everjoy, Mari, Mirel, Moshira. It has been a true privilege to share our virtual stage with you. And we look forward to the next conversation. Thank
Inshallah. Inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.